welcome everybody, and a special welcome here to Representative Jason Crow, who has represented Colorado in the House of Representatives since 2019. He sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, he sits on the Intelligence Committee, so he's got his finger on a lot of pulses. He is a former Army Ranger, and he has been very much in the news of late, especially this week. Representative Crow, thank you so much for being here.
Heather, thank you for having me back on. Really excited to do this again.
Hey, listen, anytime, not least because voices like yours are so important to have out there, and I really love bringing them out. So, and I got a lot of people asking questions after you were here before. So let's just plan to keep doing this. I was hoping to start by talking about what has happened with you in the Department of Justice this week, and then the larger implications of that for the United States Constitution, the United States, and also the international rules-based order. So we got a lot on our plate. What happened with the Department of Justice this week?
Yeah, well, Heather, this goes back to last fall when I joined 5 of my congressional colleagues, all of whom are veterans of either the military or the national security services. Included Mark Kelly and Alyssa Slotkin, and we filmed a video which reminded our service members of their obligation to fulfill their duty to the Constitution and to follow the rule of law, to follow the law. And this is actually no different than the training that they receive in basic training and what commanders remind their soldiers all the time. Donald Trump didn't like it. He accused us of treason, sedition. He said he was going to have us arrested and executed and hung. And now he has weaponized the FBI and the DOJ, both of whom have reached out to our offices and the other offices to intimidate and threaten and harass us. So that's where we are. We have hired legal counsel. We're responding to those requests, but we're going to treat them like they are. And these are not based in fact and merit. This is baseless and meritless investigation or inquiry. So what we're going to do is make sure that we are not allowing them to set an example, which they're trying to do. They're trying to bully and threaten and intimidate us, which we're not going to allow them to do. So that's kind of where we are right now. This is chapter 1 of the Autocrats playbook, is what I've been saying recently. This is what autocrats and wannabe dictators do. They try to bully leaders of the opposition to send a message to the rest of the country, and they have, in this case, chosen the wrong people.
Well, that's for sure. We've seen a great deal of pushback from you and from other people in that video. I want to ask you something about the video and the timing of it, because you just said something really interesting. You said that Donald Trump didn't like that video. But as I recall the timing, it was very significant timing because the video came out a few weeks after the initial attack on what the administration claims is a small boat coming from Venezuela, they said, were people who were narco terrorists. That was September 2nd that happened. And now we know there are at least 2 instances that happened on that day that legal analysts have called war crimes. Your video came out a few weeks after that, as I recall. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And then Donald Trump did not respond the first day. Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, responded almost immediately. And it wasn't until the next day that Trump came out against it. Am I correct about that? And do you make anything that other than the fact that maybe Trump wasn't paying very close attention?
Yeah, I think it was probably the latter. I think he wasn't paying close attention. I mean, there might have been some, synchronized response here, but I think usually when it comes to Donald Trump, he's not coordinated and synchronized with anything. Or very few things anyhow. So listen, we did this video not because of any one incident or to point to one order as being unlawful or not. We did this because there is a general atmosphere of lawlessness within this administration. We see it with ICE now. We see it with the military now. And more than anything, we see it in Donald Trump's, and we hear it in his own words, right? He has threatened to send military troops to polling stations, which would be a violation of U.S. criminal law. He's threatened to go to war with Chicago. He's now threatening the Insurrection Act against Minnesota. He asked, then Defense Secretary Esper during his first term whether he could shoot protesters in the legs. This man has no bounds. There's nothing he won't do if he feels like it serves his interest. So what we were trying to do was send a very clear message to our troops, a moment of moral clarity, that the United States Congress and the American people and those who will be pursuing accountability in the future, that we stand with those who understand what their oath requires and understands what the law requires them to do. It's a message we wanted to send, and to jumpstart a conversation, Heather, about what the law requires of our military. Right? It was an amazing thing in the weeks and months that followed that video that we saw all sorts of outlets and commentators. There was a segment of The View for like 10 minutes. The women on The View were talking about the UCMJ and the law of armed conflict. That was exactly what we wanted to do, was to get people thinking about this beforehand, because we know, having been in combat situations before, that if you wait until the moment, if you wait until someone's given an order and a young private has to make a split-second decision to shoot or not shoot or do something or not do something, you have failed them. You have to train before, you have to think about it before, and you have to have the conversations in advance of the mission.
Well, you and your colleagues have done a number of things this week that are attempting both to address the issue that you've identified here, the Department of Justice being weaponized to go after members of Congress, in addition to other people as well. And you've also looked forward, as you say, to get ahead of certain things. Can you walk us through, first of all, a bill that you co-sponsored for pushing back against this weaponization of the government against members of Congress and others?
Yeah, so Chris Murphy and I joined forces last fall. This actually was following the Jimmy Kimmel incident, when we had, as folks might recall, Donald Trump was using the FCC, his power over the FCC, to intimidate the media outlet to pull Jimmy Kimmel off the air. When that happened, Chris and I got together and we're like, well, we need to bolster legislation and bolster the guardrails to prevent the weaponization of the government against individual Americans, against companies, against businesses. The guardrails are not sufficient. So we came together and we introduced the NOPE Act, the No Political Enemies Act, which provides a cause of action, the ability of businesses and individuals to sue the federal government if the federal government comes after them for their individual political beliefs. And that can take a lot of different forms. It could take the form of a denial of a license, or a government agency intimidating a business or a CEO because of something that a CEO or somebody in that business said that the government doesn't like. There's a lot of different forms it can take, but we realized that there weren't enough guardrails. So we introduced the NOPE Act, and we are pursuing that pretty vigorously. And this just goes into the category of all the lessons learned from the era of Trump. I've been dealing with Donald Trump, as we all have been, for almost a decade now. We've learned a lot of lessons about how few guardrails there really are in our democracy, and how we need to bolster those by putting things into statute in many cases.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because, of course, there is all through the Constitution and in our history the idea that, of course, the government should never do anything like that. And that in the past, it was enough to have a warning of a leader that he could be impeached, or, this was not something one did, to make that person back off. And of course, Trump's never done that. So you actually using the law to say, this is the principle, but here's some ways that you can actually act on it, I thought was really interesting. Now, in this moment, you've also taken on the issue of the war powers, something else that is in our Constitution that limits the declaration of war to the Congress, and yet has enabled people in the executive branch to grab a lot of that power, especially since World War II. In that case as well, you and some colleagues have entered into the record some legislation to codify the war powers. Can you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, Heather, this is one of the reasons I actually came to Congress. This is one of the top issues that I'm personally passionate about. I was sent to war 3 times for this country. I went to Iraq, which we now know was a war based on oil, not on weapons of mass destruction. And I, like millions of Americans, largely from working class backgrounds in rural areas, had to bear the brunt of those wars, not elites like Donald Trump and oil executives and others who reaped the benefits. Always they reap the benefits and we bear the burden. So yeah, I'm pretty upset about the long history of endless conflict and how the constitutional balance of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch has become so broken down on the issue of war powers. So what I've been trying to do is reassert congressional authority and to reestablish that balance. Ultimately, philosophically, I believe this, that if Congress has to vote regularly on conflict and appropriate money regularly on conflict, that we will return accountability and we will make smarter decisions. Right? Nobody's ever going to tell me that Iraq and Afghanistan that went on for almost 20 years and we spent trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, that wouldn't have ended sooner and different than it did if Congress every year had to go back to high school gymnasiums, Rotary clubs, civic organizations, and stand before their constituents and tell them why they were voting to keep this going and why they were sending their taxpayer dollars to fund it. So it's the return of the accountability. So I am sponsoring a broader War Powers Reform Act, which would apply for everything. It would put additional guardrails on congressional power and executive use of war powers, and then more specifically, a bill to prevent the president from going to war with our NATO allies, which is absurd to think that we even need to talk about that and do it, but here we are.
Before we get into the NATO allies and what's happening with Greenland at this very moment, meaning, by the way, if you're listening to me and concerned by me just saying that, there is a U.S. delegation in Denmark right now talking about that issue. There's nothing else in the news that I'm aware of. Before we get to that, you just said something interesting about Iraq, where you talked about how it was for oil. But one of the things that really jumped out to me about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was the degree to which we had privatized the war machine, if you will, really taking off during those wars. And I know you sit on the Armed Services Committee. One of the things that always jumps out to me when we talk about the growth of the U.S. government is that, in fact, the civil service has not grown much at all since the 1960s, but what has gone off the charts is military contracting. Is that a legitimate concern on my part? Even more than the oil, the real money to be made out of Iraq and Afghanistan seemed to me to be moving money from the American taxpayer into the pockets of military contractors.
Yeah, it's a huge concern, and it's one of the ways that presidents have skirted war powers and congressional authority. Right, and actually, you look at the number of troops as they went down in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the spending in that case remained very high, and the reason was because military contractors, even mercenaries in some cases, were doing the functions that our soldiers and sailors and airmen would normally do. And even look at what's happening in Haiti right now, where there's a large private contract kind of private military force that's doing a lot of the security functions. So I'm deeply disturbed by this broader trend of the outsourcing and the privatization of core national security tasks, right? Because it sweeps under the rug really tough decisions that our policymakers and people like me should be forced to debate and vote on, right? So it's the biggest problem to send our young men and women, our sons and daughters and brothers and sisters into harm's way. That is the most solemn obligation we have. But second to that is our taxpayer dollars, our hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of taxpayer dollars. And I'm unwilling to skirt either one of those obligations by privatizing and or removing the duty to vote on these things. So that's ultimately where we need to be. And it is a broader trend. Yeah, I remember, I'll tell you a quick story. I remember in Afghanistan in 2005, I was at a forward operating base really far along the Afghan-Pakistan border, and I was with my Ranger platoon, and we went to the dining facility, in this tent at our operating base, and there was a military contractor. It was a young kid who was there scooping potatoes. Like, his job was, he sat behind the counter and he would slop the potatoes onto our trays, and we would eat the mashed potatoes every day. And at one point, one of my Ranger privates said, "Hey, what are you getting paid, man? To dish up our potatoes?" And the kid's like, "I'm getting paid $100K a year to do this."
Wow.
And my ranger was like, wow, okay, because I'm getting paid less than half that to go out on combat missions and to do the tough work on the front line. So it was a blow to his morale personally, but it just is one of so many examples of the amount of money and the enrichment on the private side, the war complex that grew out of these wars that remains actually in many cases.
Well, and the other piece of that, I'm interested in the domestic uh, outcome of that as well. And one of the other pieces of that is that all those jobs, like working in a kitchen or like repairing trucks or like doing all the sorts of maintenance issues for the military that used to be done by people employed by the US military, that could then be used back in civilian life, is not actually happening. And that, I think, is something we need to grapple with as a country as well. Because, when, at least I'm much older than you, when I was growing up, there were, are lots of people in the community had learned their skills that they turned into careers in the military. And that doesn't seem to be happening as much anymore, at least anecdotally.
That's also a great point. There's not every person who joins the army is an infantryman like I was, right? That's something actually most aren't, right? Infantry is only about 10% of the overall force, and people learn really important skills. The army serves a lot of purposes. The main purpose is to keep us safe and to fight and win our wars and to respond to threats. That is the core purpose, but it's also served as a standard bearer of our values. It was the military that actually led the way in integrating America after World War II. And so it should be doing that, and it's not under Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. But it also does bring our country together, right? It takes people from urban areas and rural places, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, straight, gay, just like my platoon, actually, that was incredibly diverse and came from everywhere. And it puts us all together, and we have to get along and we have to work together. It breaks down those barriers that are so high right now in America that I think is one of the reasons why we're so polarized, because we don't work together. We don't serve together. We don't do hard things together in the way that we used to. And it's so easy to demonize each other. So it also has served that purpose, and it also gives people critical skills. Because I say that not every private becomes a general. And in fact, most privates and sergeants leave the military. That's just the way it works eventually. And it is our job to make sure that that transition is effective, that we're taking care of them, that we have a veteran system that recognizes the fact that people ultimately leave the service, and we should start that pipeline early on into their service, and we have to make sure that we're providing them with important skills.
Well, that's a great transition, right? What you said there about how much starts in our military to change society. And you identified how Truman desegregated the military, but now we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing some of the frontline changes that the administration is trying to make to the United States coming by way of the military. And of course, where I'm going here is into what appears to be a burgeoning attack on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization by initiating an attack on Greenland. And there are any number of ways we could take this, but you've been deeply involved in pushing back against this. Why don't you take this discussion anywhere you'd like it to go?
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk in Washington. When I'm in Washington, people always use these words and phrases, and I just want to grab them by the shoulder and like, stop using that phrase because nobody understands what you're talking about, right? And one of those famous phrases is the rules-based international order, right? Which is a very popular thing to say in Washington, and when you're on these congressional delegations, and they're like, oh, he's undermining the rules-based international order, and I tell people, stop it, right? Like nobody understands that. So let me break it down as to what this means. America is strong because we have friends. We're not strong just because we have aircraft carriers and B-1 bombers and a big military budget, right? That is not what makes us the strongest. The strongest is that when we do things, we do it with a coalition. We go with friends. When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, we go with friends. In fact, here's a really important fact relative to Greenland. So Denmark, which is the sovereign that has the protectorate over Greenland, Denmark went to war with us in Afghanistan after 9/11. And Denmark, other than the United States, had the highest per capita casualty rate of any NATO ally. right? It was the Danes that were fighting, dying, and bleeding with us, literally, in Afghanistan. And Donald Trump is now bullying them like a mob boss, right? So that makes me pretty damn upset too, right? That my friends and my partners and my fellow war veterans are being treated that way. So that's what's at stake here, right? The NATO alliance, our 30 plus countries have fought with us, have served with us, share intelligence with us, train with us, bear a burden on our military operations and missions. And yes, they need to bear more of a burden. I agree with that. And they are making that investment now, actually way before Donald Trump. They've been making those investments and increasing those investments, even though he takes credit for it. It happened before him. And if we undermine that alliance, Americans will be less safe. That is the bottom line.
Well, and the rules based international order is also about literally that, the idea that big countries won't attack smaller countries because they knew they would come up against this great group of friends, the North American Treaty Organization, that would stand with each other so that wouldn't happen. And of course, one of the people who really wanted to make that go away was Russian President Vladimir Putin, who likes this idea of a return to one big power in a sector who then controls the other smaller countries around him. And that's this attack on Greenland or the threats against Greenland, which would attack a NATO ally in Denmark and Greenland both, really would undermine that entire system. And certainly Tom Nichols in The Atlantic and other people as well have said this is an extraordinary change in our foreign affairs and in the world itself. Do you want to speak to that? Because you also, I think, introduced legislation that would put some limits as to what a president could do.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's Article 5, as you point out, of the NATO Charter. That is the attack on one is an attack on all provision, and it's the core of the NATO partnership, right? Everything that happens with NATO revolves around Article 5, and it's what gives the alliance teeth and actual meaning. And if there's any question that America will or will not abide by Article 5, or if America itself violates Article 5, as the president's rhetoric would suggest, then the happiest person will be Vladimir Putin and President Xi in China. Because what they want, what autocrats and dictators like them want, they want nothing more than a world where the strong can take the weak, right? Where if you have a bigger military, you can just take what you want, resources, land, control, power. That's what they want. And if these alliances that have kept all of that in check for now 80 plus years dissolve, then it is a world that none of us want to live in, right? That will be a free-for-all. The cascading effect of that, the number of dictators and strongmen around the world who are just chomping at the bit right now to go after their weaker neighbors will do so pretty quickly if they don't believe that the United States and our allies will stand behind these rules. So what I'm doing is looking for every way to bolster that, right? Legislatively, to take some power away from this runaway presidency, to put it back in the Congress, which has actually clearly delineated foreign affairs powers and treaty powers. And it's one of the many things that's given up, right? Congress has ceded not just its war powers, but its treaty powers, its trade powers, its immigration powers. There's so many things that the founders put in Congress that over decades now we have given to a presidency that is probably at the height of its power. You would probably know more than I do. You'd be able to opine on this, Heather, but it's my personal opinion that the U.S. presidency is probably at the height of its powers historically relative to any other presidency. And we see the very real dangers of that with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, and I'm fascinated by your attempts to put real laws in place, rules in place that will say not just, oh, the president shouldn't do this and the Constitution says he can't, but rather takes it to the next step and says, and if he does, here's how we can push back against that. Because that, I remember in the first term when he was openly breaking the emoluments clause and everyone kept saying, you can't do that, but there wasn't really any way to go after him. And I
Right.
remember people talking about, well, maybe, a hotel owner could sue him for taking business away from them. And of course, that was never going to go anywhere.
Right. Which brings us back to the original point around making things statutory, right? All the things that we have come to realize over the past decade that are norms and customs and traditions of our democracy that Republicans and Democrats respected and abided by, that now this presidency and the party that supports him does not. We have to learn those lessons and we have to codify it.
So I'm going to let you go because it is Friday afternoon, and I suspect you would love to at least start thinking about a weekend. But I'm going to leave you where I always leave you and others, and that's that people are concerned about this. We know from the polls that Americans do not want to attack Greenland. They do not want us, taking over Venezuela. They do not want the president going after his enemies, and so on. What do you suggest people do to make their voices known against ICE, against all the different things that are bothering Americans pretty significantly right now?
But here's the great news: people are doing it. Right? There's a lot of cowardice in America right now. CEOs are bending the knee and buckling. We see universities signing agreements, capitulating. We see law firms doing it. There are some glaring examples of people who have put their self-interest and corruption ahead of our democracy. But actually, ultimately, I think when the story of this moment is written, 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's not going to be their story. It's not going to be the story of their cowardice. It's going to be the story of all the heroism that we're seeing right now. The millions of Americans who are protesting and organizing. The thousands of Americans who are sitting there and tape recording ICE abuses and writing down license plate numbers and badge numbers. The county clerks who are still moving elections forward despite death threats and threats by people. There are just countless acts of courage and heroism around the country of citizen oversight. The Little League coach in Harlem who put himself in between the ICE agents and his Little League players and said, "No, these are my kids, go away." I could go on for hours. This is the story. Americans are standing up, and we're getting our footing. We're finding the courage, and the tide really is shifting right now. And that ultimately is what keeps me going. And I think we're going to take our democracy back. It's not a sure thing, and it's going to be a hell of a battle, but it is happening.
Well, amen to that, Representative Crow. And I would add to that, those of us on the other side are watching the people in Congress who are standing up for our democracy. You are among the leaders, and I really appreciate it. And I will speak for others here. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope you do manage to find some time to relax this weekend, and that we will do this again soon and check back in, and things will look better at that moment than they seem to right now. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday at 4:00, where I try and answer some of your questions about what's happening in the modern world with regard to American politics, but also how that ties into history, the longer story of how that ties into history. A reminder, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. So let me start here with what seems to be on everybody's mind. And that is, once again, the United States Postal Service. And just remember, I have written about the USPS at least 3 times, and I've done 2 of these talks about the post office. So people have very specific questions about what one could do to help the post office. And boy, did I have an ace in the hole on that, because a good friend of mine in graduate school was Richard R. John, who is the premier scholar of the United States Postal Service, and a brilliant guy. And I finally was like, I'll just go to the source and see what he has to say about the U.S. Postal Service. He's now a professor at the Columbia School of Journalism, I think it is. Sorry if I got that wrong, Richard. In any case, he had a number of things to say. And I just want to emphasize here that I will tell you what he said, but I'm also going to embellish it with my own understanding. So some of this does come from me, and if it is incorrect, I promise you it comes from me and not from the world's expert on the United States Postal Service. So Richard's got a clean bill here. I may say something that is less correct, although obviously I'll try not to. All right, so one of the first things he said is to remember that the Postal Service has a civic mandate. And that civic mandate was enshrined in an act in 1792 called the Post Office Act. And what the Post Office Act did that was more than just delivering letters, because you think about the post office, you think about letters and packages. But what it did was it also permitted newspaper editors and people who own newspapers to mail their newspapers at a lower cost than a first-class mail cost. And the reason for that is that it was designed to promote civic engagement. The founders actually wanted people to know what was happening. They wanted them to be informed, and they wanted them to have a channel of communication from Washington, D.C. to the people in the hinterlands. So not only was there this ability for people to put their newspapers into the mail cheaply to circulate information, but also if you were a member of Congress and certain dignitaries, certain people certain leaders, you had what was called the franking privilege. And that meant that you could simply sign a document, a pamphlet, for example, of a speech you'd given or something, and it would go through the mails for free. And the idea behind that was that it would enable people at home to know what their Congress people were up to, what they were talking about, and the things that were important for them. So the whole point of the United States Postal Service was not simply to get letters from A to B, but it really was an attempt to make sure that people had civic engagement, that they knew what was happening, and that you didn't have to pay for that service, that it was actually sort of part of being a country, was having this larger community that was knit together by this postal service in the government. And one of the things that Richard points out is that act, in addition to doing that, promoting civic engagement, it also had the idea of privacy, that you could send things through the mail and it would be sacrosanct, that people couldn't open your mail, that it's a federal offense to open mail, which, by the way, that's a big deal. I mean, you don't open somebody else's mail, and it actually is, you're not supposed to do that. It's part of the law. Now, it's worth pointing out that this mandate for civic engagement actually has the support of the founders. So the idea that we can toss this overboard is really a rejection of that. So, for example, Richard says that that mandate, that civic engagement mandate, had the support of Washington and Madison both. And he also points out that we all talk a lot about free speech. And this I'm getting partly from conversations with him over the years. And so free speech is such a deeply held idea in America. It's enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And, we have all these ideas that we can say anything we want. Well, saying things isn't the end game, in a sense, because what you really need to do is have access to a network to disseminate those ideas. So one of the things that the post office does until the 20th century is that it really is the bulwark of free speech, that because it is accessible, because it is cheap, and that the mails have to be carried, you actually can get traction if you have a new idea because of the United States Postal Service. Now, there's some exceptions to that, notably the abolitionist mail campaign of the 1840s, when the Southern slave owners would not actually let mail be delivered. But when that happened, there was such a public outcry. It's one of the major things that leads to the Civil War. So this idea of access to public engagement is really part and parcel of the post office. So that's the first thing to think about, is what the post office is supposed to be about, and not to limit your thinking in the idea that it's about delivering a letter to, my best friend. It's about this idea of having some kind of civic engagement. And in a different conversation, I think it's worth talking about what that has to say about the internet, because access to the internet is also a really deeply held now issue in terms of being part of civic engagement. If you're in a place where you can't get access to the internet, you don't have that. You might have free speech, or you might have the right to hear what people say, but it doesn't do you any good if you can't actually tie into it. So that's a different discussion, but it's worth having in the back of your minds. All right, so here's another piece from Richard. He says, the post office department, as it was called then, that's going to change in the 20th century. It ran a deficit most of the time that it existed between the 1850s until the 1960s. The post office was just considered a public good, so people didn't worry about the fact it wasn't making money. He says no one cared, that it wasn't making money. That wasn't the point. The point was it was an investment in American democracy and in the infrastructure of American democracy. So another piece that he mentions is that the Postmaster General has for a long time been a member of the cabinet. You need a Postmaster General, right? And he, from the 1830s until the 1960s, he was often the party chair for whatever party was in office. And the reason for that is because if you think about it, post offices had postmasters at the time, although they're going to be postmistresses at least by the 20th century. They have postmasters in every single town. So for example, the town I grew up in, it covered a large area, and it had one police force, probably one police officer, but one police force that covered all this huge area. But it was divided into villages, and the villages were distinguished by the fact they had a post office. They didn't have anything else. They didn't have their own police. They didn't have anything else, but they had their own post office. And so that was sort of a central hub for the people in the villages within the much larger town. And a lot of rural areas are like that. But what this meant was in an era when positions in the government were filled by patronage, that is, that you got them because you were a reliable voter for whichever party was in power. And there's a philosophy behind that. But if that were the case, what that means is that the Postmaster General has an incredible amount of power over the party. And you can see this after the election or the installment of Rutherford B. Hayes into the White House in 1877. He has cut a deal with Southern Democrats to get the electoral votes from the three Southern states. There were four that were contested, but one was out west. The three Southern states that had contested electoral votes. And the deal he cut was that he would back internal improvements in the South, especially railroads, but also that he would appoint a Democrat to his cabinet as Postmaster General. And a lot of people look at that now and they're like, Postmaster General, who cares? It was a huge deal in the 19th century because what that meant is you basically had control over one person in all of these places. So although the Postmaster General was often the party chair, he has never before now, according to Richard, been credibly accused of undermining the electoral process. That even if they liked a party more than another, and certainly there were a lot of shenanigans that went on at the local level, the Postmaster General has always played it straight. Which is saying something right now. People often ask me, have we ever had an administration like this? And the answer is emphatically no. We are absolutely in uncharted water, which I will tell you has some huge room for potential as well as for chaos. What is the old saying about how the opposite of chaos is potential? So he said that. He also pointed out that the men and women of the United States Postal Service deliver half the world's mail. We have half the world's mail, and they deliver it on time and efficiently. And people sometimes complain about the U.S. mail, but what other organization do you know that is that reliable that much of the time? And they really do an amazing job. And he said, let's not forget about the fact that these are men and women who are simply doing a really, really good job. And until very recently, United States Postal Service carriers, letter carriers, were more than just letter carriers, and to some degree they still are. They checked in on the elderly because they were the only ones who had contact with a lot of people. If somebody didn't pick up their mail for a couple of days, they would do a call for a wellness check on them. They kind of had an idea, an eye out on the town of what was happening. So they were really, really vital pieces of American history, and obviously still are. Richard always points out that privatization has never been popular. It has never been able to command any kind of popular support. He does suggest that there is one exception to that in the 1840s, But that's actually, there's a long story of what else goes on in the 1840s, and my guess is you don't really care about that. But in fact, the United States Postal Service was so well regarded in the late 19th century that a number of reformers actually proposed nationalizing the telegraphs and the railroads and running them like the post office department, because it seemed so much more efficient than any kind of the unrestrained capitalism that was in fact running those other things in that era. And the post office department was so well run and such a source for information that it was often referred to as an agent of civilization that ranked up there with the mariner's compass and the printing press. So again, to think of it as something separate than just, part of the government, it actually is an old enshrined part of our government. But then what she really asked me for was what does one do to protect it under these circumstances? And one of the things that I would start with by saying is that this is, of course, a political attack on the Postal Service, the United States Postal Service. And in fact, the Republicans have always urged people to vote by mail because it's much easier for older voters who tend to vote Republican. And the past have voted Republican. I'm not so sure that's going to be the case anymore at all, but it has really been that way since the 1980s. It's been an easier way for them than to have to get out and get to the polls. So the Republicans use mail-in voting they've always urged it. And a number of states actually vote by mail as well without any problems at all. So this idea now suddenly that we've got a crisis over mail-in voting is a manufactured political crisis. This is now a party issue. And the United States Post Office has never been a partisan thing. It just hasn't been. But one of the things to remember, and Richard points out, is that while we are right now thinking about, and he didn't actually say this, so I hate to put words in his mouth, but something he said went this direction. While we were talking about mail-in voting as being the central issue right now, in fact, if the Postal Service becomes privatized, this is going to devastate small businesses. Because a lot of small businesses, including small businesses in red states, depend on the United States Postal Service. Because the story behind it is this. The United States Postal Service often does what's called last mile service. So they're the ones who actually manage to figure out how to get the package from the nearest town down to wherever the rural area is. And they do it at a much lower cost than a privatized system would. So a lot of people really depend on them for their businesses, and the devastation that losing that would actually collapse a lot of rural businesses in red states as well as in blue states. And the other piece of this is that I did not realize until I wrote the piece the other day on the United States Postal Service, is that as soon as he was in office, and I didn't really pay attention to this because I think we were busy looking at the travel ban and all the other stuff that happened, the Trump administration produced a blueprint for what it wanted to do, and it explicitly called for the privatization of the United States Postal Service. It said getting rid of that would be more efficient, and it would be, it would be better for everybody. But of course, what that means is that turning over both the real estate and the fleet of trucks, and especially the proprietary information that the United States Postal Service has, would really hugely benefit the private carriers. And what would probably happen is that the cost of carrying packages and mail and all that in urban areas might even go down. It certainly would stay somewhat cheap. But for anybody who isn't living in an immediate urban area, you're going to pay a huge sum of money. And of course, nowadays we get our drugs through the mail, we get packages through the mail. We do so much online now that gets delivered to our own homes rather than us going out and finding it. The extra costs that will add to regular households is really unsustainable, is what it amounts to. The other point that in terms of supporting the United States Post Office that Richard makes is to remember that postal unions are that postal carriers are unionized. And they have a vested interest in defending the United States Postal Service. Support your local postal union, first of all. And remember as well that of the, I believe it's 630,000 employees that the United States Postal Service has, They are, for a corporation of that size, they're disproportionately people of women, color, and United States veterans. More than 100,000 of them are veterans. And this is, I think, not an accident that this is one of the things that the Trump administration would like to get rid of. It's an organization that hires a lot of Black people, brown people, women, and veterans, and a lot. It's over 600,000 of them. So I believe I've got that number right. Again, that's off the top of my head. I wrote it up the other day. So support those unions and support the idea of employing, our veterans, our people of color, and our women. The other thing that he points out is there is a man at New York University, he's a literature professor. His name is Steve Hutkins. He is not affiliated with the United States Postal Service, but he does run an internet site called SaveThePostOffice.org. I went to it after Richard told me about it, and he says a couple of things. He says, first of all, we must insist that Congress put in any future stimulus bill sufficient funds to stabilize the USPS through next January. And that's something, as you know, I want to remind you, of course, that the Democrats did pass a new coronavirus bill. And it's quite large. It's $3 trillion. And one of the reasons it's so expensive is because it does support the states and the local governments that have been crushed by this pandemic and who can't borrow for the future because of the way the laws are written in the states and in the towns. So they're facing these giant layoffs. It supported them. It supported hospitals and schools, and it supported the United States Postal Service. And this is, of course, something that the Senate wouldn't even take up. So when you read, like the Washington Post today said that Congress was having trouble coming up with a coronavirus bill, that's not true, actually. The Democrats in the House did. And in the Senate, the Republican caucus itself can't agree. They can't come up with one simply because some Republican congressmen just say, no, we're not going to vote for anything. And the problem with that is that Mitch McConnell doesn't want to reach across the aisle to the Democrats, and the Democrats haven't even seen anything yet. So again, just remember that we want the post office to be funded through January, not simply through the election, whatever, through at least January. And the other thing that should be in the bill, and we should demand, is that the Postmaster General must adhere to established mail delivery standards and to obey all directives and all orders that obtain over the post office. Because, it's one thing what's really going on here now is the new standards he has enacted are basically just slowing the mails down ridiculously. And again, part of the idea is that they're going to make some people so angry, they will say, okay, I don't care about the post office. But this is a deliberately created situation. It does not have to be this way. This man has also said that the Biden campaign should make it clear that it is going to defend the post office. So anyway, if you're interested in more things, go over there to SaveThePostOffice.org. A guy named Steve Hutkins at New York University. I have no affiliation with him. I don't know him, but my friend Richard, who does know the post office, recommended this. But now here's my thing. And you're going to hear this a lot today, and that is to speak up, and we keep saying this, call your senators, call your representatives, and I hear again and again, it doesn't matter, they won't do what I say. Well, no, a lot of them won't, but they do keep a record of who calls. And what politicians want is they want people to like them. They want to get reelected. And if enough people call and say, take your hands off the United States Postal Service, they'll listen, not because they necessarily are in the goodness of their hearts, but because they want to be reelected. And if you don't give them a reason to behave in a certain way, they're not going to do it. So he says, first of all, call it out. But second of all, report the letters and the packages that don't arrive, and do it on social media, as well as to your post office or to your elected officials. But let's make a wave saying, this is not acceptable what they're doing to the United States Postal Service. Because what Richard points out is that a lot of people think of the post office as a place you take a letter. And he said the reality is that it's the United States Postal Service is so reliable we don't even notice it's there. And once it's gone and you can't get your medications, you can't get whatever it is you're ordering from wherever, you can't get your magazines, you can't get any of those things, you will, and you have to start paying, much higher rates for it, you're going to understand what it is that we have lost. He also points out, of course, that the Inspector General of the Post Office does do a lot of performance checks. And there does not seem to be a reason to suddenly say that this new Postmaster General, who did not move up through the ranks, although for the last 2 decades, Postmaster Generals have moved up through the ranks, but is rather a donor to the Republican National Committee and to Donald Trump, donated more than $2 million since 2016. It's a little hard to believe that he suddenly knows something that the inspectors general don't. So, all right. So that's what I've got on the U.S. Postal Service, because so many of you are concerned about it. Now, just again, a reminder, I've done at least one of these videos, no, 2 of these videos, in addition to this one, on the Postal Service, on the history of the Postal Service. And I've written about it at least one time at great length in the letters I write. And those, by the way, you can search on Facebook. There is a tool to search posts. And in something like that, I would search USPS if you want to find it. All right, so that's one thing. The next thing that somebody mentioned that I thought was really interesting was to ask me about the crisis in childcare, and because of the pandemic. And that's a huge issue. But I actually thought it's a really interesting issue because we don't talk very much about childcare in this country. And the history of childcare is actually remarkably interesting and remarkably important and remarkably deeply tied with where we are today. So I wanted to take on the issue of childcare in America and what that even means. And let me start here by emphasizing that the idea of a nuclear family, that what it means to be an American is to have a man and a wife and little chillins running around, is very much a post-World War II construct. That idea of the heteronormative nuclear family is just not the way Americans really lived. So let me throw that in there as a marker, and then I'm going to step back a little bit to see where we got from childcare. So in the early colonial era and early national period, we have, for example, apprenticeships where children are bound out to other families, and there's all kinds of different ways for children to be reared, if you will. And by the way, I always say this to my students: vegetables are raised and children are reared, for the grammar people like me out there. So I will try to get that right here. The U.S. child care really begins in the late 19th century, and it begins in a funny way, in the same kind of way the kindergarten movement starts. And that's a movement in the 19th century in urban areas, largely around the settlement houses. And the settlement, which is actually really important for a lot of American political history going forward from there. But the settlement houses were places where middle class or upper middle class women moved, white women for the most part, had gone to college, had educations, but didn't really have jobs that they could do because they were too high class to work as domestics, for example, or as clerks, but they or as teachers, which was a profession that some young women did, but they also didn't want to sit home, and they weren't married. So what they tended to do, a number of them, it's not like thousands and thousands, but they would move into cities and buy a home in an immigrant-dominated area. And these would be places like Jane Addams did in Chicago with Hull House, but Ellen Gates Starr does it as well. There's a number of these houses in urban areas. And one of the first things that these women notice is, first of all, children tend to be left in the streets or left under the care of older siblings or whatever when the mothers had to go to work in urban America. And they thought this was terrible because these kids are falling under trolleys, and they're not learning to read, and they're not clean, and all sorts of horrible things. So they start in the settlement houses, they start nurseries so that the mothers of the mothers of the children, the small children in the cities, the factory workers can go to the factories without worrying about the fact that their kids are unattended. They need the money, so they have to do it. And that idea of caring for other people's children in an organized, clean, educational way. Remember, this is also going to be the time when people are focusing on the construction of kindergartens, child gardens, where children learn to blossom, if you will. They get the skills that they need to make them good American citizens. That idea spreads. And so there is this idea that children need special attention and that it does not have to be provided by either a mother or a person hired by the family, because you've got a lot of nursemaids, as they were called in those days, and governesses and people who did childcare sort of unofficially. Before that, but in World War II, the idea of universal child care or of organized child care provided by the federal government really takes hold. And it does so because during the war, as men go off to fight the war, the government is adamantly trying to get women into the workforce. And this is where we get the image, for example, of Rosie the Riveter. You know, the idea that any lady can come in off the streets and they can go to work and they can build bombers or they can build Navy ships or whatever they're going to do. And actually, if you are ever interested, the training clips and the recruitment clips for women in this period are fascinating because they compare what one would do on a ship to some household task. So look, spreading this whatever is just like icing a cake or whatever. And there's this really interesting dynamic where they're trying to move women from gendered female positions into gendered male positions and describing the male positions with the images of what women should be doing. And they're absolutely fascinating kind of movies. But here's a problem, of course. You need women. The government desperately needs women in the factories and in the fields and working to support the war effort. But they got kids. So they're all trying to like hammer together some kind of childcare situation for their children. And they don't want to go to the factories if it means that their child is going to be, not looked after and getting into the kind of trouble that children get into. So in 1943, an act is passed to provide federal child care for the women who are working in the factories. It was full day, year-round child care for up to 6 days a week for the women who were working in the factories, with the idea that it was going to enable women to work in the factories. And that was the case from 1943 to 1946. We had this idea of, if you wanted women to work in the factories or work for the country, you also needed to care for their children. All right, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? So after the war, that ends in 1946, and it ends in part for two reasons. It ends, first of all, because people coming out of World War II of all parties and all stripes are terrified that the Depression is going to come back. You know, it's easy for us to look backward and say, oh, of course it wouldn't, because now they understand Keynesian economics and deficit spending, and there's never going to be something like that again. No. The Depression scarred people really, really badly. And politicians of both parties were always afraid of bringing back the Depression. And you can see this all the way through Richard Nixon, who I mean, that's kind of an aside, but his financial policy, he's always seesawing between trying to stop inflation and trying to stop unemployment. He's always like madly trying to balance that, because they're all terrified of unemployment. So one of the things that happens after the war is, rather than saying, oh goody, we've got all these new workers of women in the workforce, the government says, crap, we got to get rid of the women in the workforce so that they create job openings for the men coming back, because otherwise the men aren't going to have work and we're going to have a new depression. So first of all, the idea behind getting rid of the child care is getting rid of the childcare. So women have to get back out of the workforce, first of all. But second of all, it ties into the idea of the Cold War. the post-war years, when increasingly by the 1946, 1947, and certainly into the 1950s, the American government is shaping itself around anti-communism and trying to define America as everything that is not communist. And it's doing so in part because of pressure from a faction of the Republican Party that is fervently anti-communist and is really trying to rise to power on the idea that the Democrats are closet communists, if you will. And you see this again, I keep talking about him, but you see this in 1950 with Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, who goes in, on February 9th in 1950, he goes and waves that piece of paper in front of the women's meeting in Wheeling, West Virginia, and says, I have here a list of communists. Well, he didn't have a list of communists, but there is this faction of the Republican Party that keeps trying to press the idea that Democrats are becoming communists, and as that or are bringing communism into America. And as they do so, to try and say, no, we're not communist, Americans begin to define themselves against what they perceive communism to be. And one of the things that really shows up in the 1950s is this rejection of what Americans were seeing from Chinese communism, the idea that there was no difference between the sexes, that everybody wore the same clothing, and women had to work in the factories, and the children were taken care of in these giant buildings, all these things that were associated with post-World War II Chinese, especially communism, to some degree Russian communism as well, but especially in the 50s, the Chinese communism. And this is the period in which, if you remember, as I'm talking about this whole idea of holding yourself apart, Americans holding themselves apart from this idea of Chinese communism. Think poodle skirts. Think what girls dress like then, and think of it occurs to me there's maybe younger listeners who don't know what a poodle skirt is. And I don't think I'm going to take that joy away from you. I think you should go look up poodle skirts. But the idea of girls as being sort of hyper feminized, and if you think about the way that child rearing books were written at the time, that girls were supposed to learn to bake cookies, and their fathers were supposed to compliment them on their looks and their cooking skills, and all these domestic skills that were really trying to shape them into a certain kind of hyper feminized woman. And in contrast, men got hyper masculine. I can't say the word masculinized as well. The idea that to be a true man, you had to, and you can fill in the blank there, ride a horse, there were all sorts of ways in which men were hyper masculinized. And this is also the period in the 1950s when Americans become sort of obsessed about heteronormativity. That is, America, I always talk about America. I'm not suggesting other countries don't have this, but I'm an Americanist, so that's the only country I can speak about with authority. Same-sex relationships are nothing new in world history, but certainly in American history. And they were very much a part of American society. The idea of anti-LGBTQ people is really a product of World War II. That whole sort of societal turning against the idea of any blending of gender norms really comes out of the 1950s. Well, you can see where this is going. The idea that women, who are defined in this sort of hyper-feminized way, belong in the home taking care of their children. So any attempt to make sure that they're not, to give them options for not being that way, are perceived as being a form of communism, something that's going to lead America down the road to this shapeless mass of humanity. And you can see this by the 1960s, because one of the things that people forget about when they study John F. Kennedy is Kennedy was actually a fairly large proponent of women's rights. And after World War II, of course, so many women had worked in the factories or had been in the Army Corps and the Women's Army Corps, and they came home and their attitudes were really quite different than they had been before World War II. My mother was a WAC, and that was certainly formative to all of us, the idea that a woman could simply go and join the Army and in some cases, not my mother's, but in some cases, travel the world and serve in the military. That we didn't think about the world in the same way. And There's a woman, a wonderful scholar of the women's movement, but the women's movement kind of this. I'm actually drawing a lot of what I'm going to tell you about here from some of her work. A woman named Kimberly Wilmot Voss, and she takes a look not at the people who were marching in the streets so much to promote the women's movement, but rather the people who were promoting women's rights through newspaper columns, through sort of backroom organizing. So they're not out there in front, but they're the ones who are making the wheels turn. And she points out that in 1961, John F. Kennedy issued something called Executive Order 10980, 10980. And that created the Interdepartmental Committee on the Status of Women and the Citizens Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And he put former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt at the chair of it, although she did not live to see its conclusion. The person who really tied it all together was a woman named Catherine East, whom Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, later described as, quote, the midwife to the contemporary women's movement. So people at the time recognized that the paper pushers, if you will, were really important. Again, the person, if you're interested to read about this, is Kimberly Wilmot Voss. But Kennedy said when he appointed the commission, quote, we have by no means done enough to strengthen family life and at the same time encourage women to make their full contribution as citizens. And what the commission did is it discovered that the discrimination against women was a huge problem in America in the 1960s. And they tried to reinforce the idea of tradition of protecting families. At the same time, they permitted women to make inroads into the workforce. So one of the things that they did is that they did a number of things. They supported the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm not going to talk about that now. But they also said that in order to protect women's rights, we needed to have universal daycare. We needed to be able to have women have the security to put their children somewhere affordable and safe. So they wanted to end sex discrimination hiring. They wanted paid maternity leave, and they wanted universal child care. And this is, of course, the 1963 is when they come out with their report. And by 1967, every state had commissions on the status of women to try and make this happen in 67. So where does this go? It goes into LBJ's presidency, Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency, and he is very concerned about children and what children and the conditions under which children live. And again, one of the things I'm fond of saying when people ask, can we change what's happening? I always say you can change the world in 18 years. I mean, you can completely change the world in 18 years, because if you change children, you change the future. And children are young for such a brief period of time. The fact that we neglect our children to the degree we do as a society, aside from any of the morality of it, just seems to me insane. Because if you don't have educated, well-fed, healthy children, what are you looking at in 20 years? So that was editorializing. Sorry about that. I'll go back to LBJ. LBJ is worried about too. LBJ establishes the Head Start program, the idea of making sure that we try and erase discrimination or treatment in small children. We don't have disadvantaged small children any longer, and tried to expand benefits for pregnant women and low-income children from birth to age 3. And we also get in the 1970s the issue of more and more women entering the workforce. And they're entering the workforce in part because they want to, but also in large part because of the inflation of the 1970s, which makes it increasingly difficult for a single person to make enough money to organize a household. And that, of course, is true now. It's a lovely thought that somebody in your household can stay home, but the number of families for whom that's a reality is very, very small. But one of the things that happens with this, and this fascinates me, is that when women have to enter the workforce, we have a huge change that I have never seen anybody talk about. And that is that in this period from World War II until the 1970s, the period when so many boomers were growing up, there are educated, able women who are really not welcome in the workforce, in the professional workforce. So what do? They're in the schools volunteering. They're volunteering for things like Hull House. They're taking care of the elderly. They're performing essentially an entire shadow economy, and they're not getting paid for it. So what happens is that, the men in their house are making enough money that they can afford to volunteer at the church and volunteer at the schools and take care of great Aunt Susie and do all of those things. But what happens when women enter the workforce for a paycheck is that all of that volunteer labor that they had been doing disappears. But Americans still need that to happen. They still need the child care, and they still need someone to care for great Aunt Susie, and they still need somebody to clean up the church and fill in the blank, do all of those things that the women had been doing for free. And instead of ponying up the cash and saying, we need this to happen, we must have a revolution in the way we look at paid work, and that we must consider childcare, for example, paid work, we don't do that. We simply pull those volunteer women out of the workforce, put them back into it as paid people at wages that can't support hiring good child care and care for all those things that women have done. And we've never reckoned with that. We still want those things done, but nobody wants to pay for it. And it doesn't work. I mean, it's one of those things that just doesn't work. And that's something I think that we have never adequately grappled with. And we have never adequately grappled with it in part because of that imagery of the nuclear family, which by the time, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nixon, by the time of Nixon becomes really takes over the political scene, that this is the way America lives. No, it's not. Americans haven't lived that way since, the 1960s, if that, and that largely didn't include people of color anyway. So that this image of the nuclear family where mommy takes care of the kiddos is really had always been a fantasy. So what happens then, not always, I mean, there's a period when it looks viable, but it's a very short period. So what happens is in 1971, Congress actually passes a universal child care bill. It's called the Comprehensive Child Development Bill, and it provides a multi-billion-dollar national daycare system. It's supposed to make it easier for people to work and take care of their children at the same time. And theoretically, this would relieve the welfare system because you no longer had, the problem now when people say single mothers should be working. Well, what are they going to do with their kids? I mean, we've got a whole problem here that is not solvable unless you have some kind of childcare. So we're done, right? 1971, we get Congress to pass a bipartisan law that provides for a multi-billion-dollar form of universal childcare. Nixon vetoes it. Nixon vetoes that law because he says it is a communal approach to child rearing, and he ties it into the idea of communism. That this is, again, these communists taking over American society, which by 1968, 1970, 1972 was really what Nixon was trying to stay in power on, the idea that he was holding the line against these leftists who were trying to destroy American society. The idea that women want to work outside the home and the idea that women want to have childcare to enable them to work outside the home gets tied into this idea of communism, but it also gets tied into the idea that Nixon also pushes very heavily after 1970, and that's the idea that women who want to compete with men on terms of equality in the workforce are somehow asking for special interest legislation. They are, in fact, a special interest. And you can see this really dramatically in 1984, when Walter Mondale runs for president as a Democrat, and he taps Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. And Geraldine Ferraro is a representative from New York. She sits on the House Armed Services Committee. She's been the head of the part of the Democratic Party. She's an incredibly talented woman. And when that happens, when he taps her, I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate vice presidential nominee. When that happens, 60% of Americans say that Mondale is simply trying to cater to a special interest, which is just crazy. But you can see how we have gotten to the point now where the idea of women being in politics and being active in the public sphere is somehow indicative of the fact that they are rejecting traditionalism, because the idea that somehow a woman wanting to be equal is a special interest. And you see that in 84, but you see it increasingly as well after after the Reagan years, and after the increasing emphasis on a nuclear family and the strong macho guy and the woman who's supposed to be home being taken care of. And you see that, of course, really dramatically in the under Reagan, but then, of course, during George W. Bush's years, and then as well, really, you can see where we have gotten now with the Fox News channel and with President Trump, the idea that women are objects either for sex or derision. And if that's the case, where women really belong is home taking care of their children. It's not viable, but in this economy, but that's the idea. And so we have not had childcare. There was an attempt in 1988 to introduce a comprehensive childcare bill, a much less of one that was vetoed, than Nixon vetoed in 72. That was the Act for Better Child Care Services, and it was actually a bipartisan bill. It was introduced by a Democrat, Christopher Dodd, and Republican Senator John Chafee, to try and help low-income families get affordable childcare, affordable, reliable childcare. But it initially actually passed, but then it got balled up because of technical issues, and finally they ended up not doing it in 88 because of the idea that you didn't want to give more power to the federal government. They ended up giving block grants to the states to try and develop some kind of childcare system for low-income people at the states. So all this to say, where are we right now with the incredible lack of childcare? If there is a ray of hope in everything that I've just outlined here with the childcare, and also with the attack on the United States Postal Service, it's that we've got a problem. It is not viable for an economy where families need two incomes and I would actually go beyond that. I would actually suggest that it doesn't matter that that's the case, that you should just make sure that, well, whatever, it's not viable for there to be, for us not to have reliable childcare, for childcare to be this expensive and this unreliable, this unreliable, it's, hard to find. And it's very clear now with the pandemic and with the fact that so many people's childcare arrangements have fallen through the cracks and people can't go to work without them, that we must do something to fix that. And this is one of the places, speaking of putting pressure on people for the United States Postal Service, this is another one that I would put enormous pressure for, and say we simply must have cheap, universal childcare for children, and we must reach this moment where we no longer look at government intervention as something to be avoided, but rather as a place where we can accomplish things like the delivery of the mails, like the construction of a civic identity, that we can't as individuals. It's just so much more efficient, and so much more reliable, and so much cheaper to do it as a team. Especially for something like childcare, where somebody like me would pay into it, and my kids are done and gone, and I'm totally cool with that. So anyway, all right. So that was childcare. You have a couple more questions where where I think I can give you quick answers. The first is people are asking, what will it take to convince people to turn against Donald Trump? It's a lost cause at this point. It just is. I mean, don't think of it like I keep saying. Think of it like your friend who's in an abusive relationship. The more you try and push back, the more that your friend will cling to the abuser, because that person already has so much invested in that relationship. The only thing that's going to change it is if that person sees for him or herself that what they believed was wrong. And so, I constantly get questions saying, what can I say to my uncle? And I'll give you the answers to the whatever outrageous thing they've said, but all you can do is try and model a healthier relationship with your government than to try and fight it head on. Second, people asked about vice presidential selections, and I can tell you a little bit about those. You have to remember that a vice presidential selection is usually about bringing extra support to the ticket. So, for example, I've talked about this before. Abraham Lincoln taps Hannibal Hamlin in Maine because Maine votes for representatives before anybody else does, and having a leg up in Maine meant a lot in 1860. In other cases, generally a party is trying to balance two factions. So if one faction's mad, the other faction will generally get the vice presidential slot, like with James Garfield, who he is part of a reform part of the Republican Party in 1880. So they put this corrupt Chester Arthur in the second spot with the idea just to bring both sides of the party on, because essentially you're trying to create a coalition. One of the things that I keep seeing are people are getting really attached to one vice presidential candidate or another, the same way you get attached to a presidential candidate or another. I would not lose a lot of sleep about that, because what you're essentially doing is you're electing a team, and what the team needs to do is to bring enough people on board to get elected. So, for example, Kamala Harris is a name that's definitely bandied about, and Kamala Harris is just a brilliant senator from California. She may or may not be vice president. I have no inside information, but if she is not, it doesn't mean she's going to disappear from that administration. She obviously is a player in the future administration. Similarly, Elizabeth Warren. Now you also have to remember that there's issues. So a lot of people really like Elizabeth Warren. She's a much more progressive part of the party, of the Democratic Party, than Joe Biden. But if she gets tapped for the vice presidential slot, that opens up a seat in the Senate. And it's not entirely clear, because the law changes fairly frequently in Massachusetts, but it's not entirely clear that she would be replaced by a Democrat. The governor of Massachusetts is a Republican, and he would be within his rights under the current law to replace her with a Republican. That's how we got Scott Brown, if you remember back after Kennedy died. And so it's kind of like a chess game. So you don't necessarily want, even if you love Elizabeth Warren, you may not want her on the VP slot, because it will weaken the chances of the Democrats to keep the Senate. So there's a lot of those factors that go into play. And again, Warren, even if she is not on the ticket, is already exercising a lot of influence on the campaign. And I actually really like the idea of all these different ideas in there, because that's how you create good movement, is to have some people coming in and going, man, I want Medicare for all, and somebody else going, wait a minute, here's a problem with that, and somebody else going, oh, that's a good point, let's fix it by doing this, and somebody else saying, oh, that maybe would work, but then what are we going to do about this? That's how you get administrations that move the ball forward in an effective way. And you can see that with Abraham Lincoln's administration, for example, and with FDR's, where he often got people who completely argued with each other. And on at least one occasion, he would say, thank you for your information. Thank you for your information. And then he would put them in a room and say, now come out when you two agree. And then he wouldn't let them out for lunch or to go to the bathroom. So they would end up agreeing in some form or another. So in terms of who Biden's going to pick, he's doing a calculation that says, these are the people, this is who will bring the most onto the ticket in order to get elected. And then once this team is elected, then the rest will play out in the wash. Somebody asked if vice presidential selections ever hurt the ticket. Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin was a very typical John McCain move. When he kind of got up against the wall in his life, he always did these sort of Hail Mary things, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they really didn't. Sarah Palin was a really big didn't. That hurt him badly. had she been as effective as she looked at first, she could have been a brilliant move. Of course, it turned out the veneer was very thin on her. A couple other things. So in terms of vice presidential selections, I have no particular insight, but when there is a selection made, recognize that what is really at stake here is certainly the presidency, but the Senate. If the Senate does not flip hands, if Mitch McConnell stays at the head of the Senate as the Senate majority leader, nothing's going to happen. What the Democrats really are focusing on now is guaranteeing control of the Senate, and it's going to be a hard slog, let me tell you. So you might not like the selection. I might not like the selection. The guy next door might not like the selection. But what they're trying to do is get the presidency over the finish line and get the Senate. Because if the Democrats take the Senate, Mitch McConnell will become the minority leader, although he might not do that. And my guess is he'll leave. He's 78 years old. He does not want to play second fiddle to anyone. He insists he's not going to leave the Senate, but oh, come on. He's been ruled the country now all that time. They never like to step down. If you remember, a lot of Republican representatives stepped down and did not run for re-election because they didn't like being in the minority. All right, two more things here very quickly. I think I got 1 or 2 more minutes. People have asked about the Russia bounty scandal. Why is that not a bigger deal? The Russia bounty scandal is a very big deal. And again, sort of thing you just want to keep talking about. The American people in a democracy get to call the shots, and certainly people like me are talking about it. And it's in the newspapers. It's just being studiously ignored by the White House, and I think it's a really big deal. So, by the way, is the information about Brazil that I wrote about last night. But the Russia bounty scandal, that's really new. I mean, that's a new horrible thing. And finally, somebody asked about the Axios interview that Trump did last night. And I wanted to say it is worth watching. And it is an interview with Donald Trump by a reporter named Jonathan Swan, who simply just called him out on stuff. Lots of reporters, he says, the president says something outrageous, and they go, okay, and they go on to something else. Swan kept stopping him and saying, no, that's not right. Here's what's right. And it was very clear that Trump was completely unable to operate in the real world. And so where I'm going to end with this is, A, you should watch it, and it's getting a lot of traction because it's really revealing. But B, we are in, people keep telling me how depressed they are and how frustrated they are and how frightened they are and what can they do. Yeah, we're in a really frightening time. But it's not over yet. We're in this period of trying to make the election free and fair. And as I wrote last night, Trump isn't even pretending he's trying to win this election fairly. We're in an election that we're trying to keep free and fair. And now is the time to make yourselves heard. Now is the time to volunteer as poll workers, but more than that, to put pressure repeatedly on your local officials, your state officials, and your federal officials, and to be on social media and talk about what you care about, and to be very careful about not spreading the crap that's already coming over the transom from Russia, but to really talk about taking back America for our values. And I don't mean a Republican set of values or a Democratic set of values, but the idea of equality before the law and equality of access to resources and the ability to have leaders who are not robbing us blind and who are actually following the law. Those are things that are not partisan. And those are things that I think if we focus on will help remove the current regime from power. All right, I think that was exactly 60 minutes. I'm going to leave you to it, and I'm going to go batten down the hatches for the storm. Thank you for coming. I am doing we're moving on in the Republican Party on Thursday, unless my power is completely knocked out, but I don't expect that. And that's Thursday at 1 o'clock, and I will see you then if you're interested in the history. Otherwise, I'll be back here, God willing, next Tuesday at 4 o'clock Maine time. Thanks a lot for coming.